with us still. Joining us on set, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith. Hello, Ben. How you doing?
Having me?
How you doing, Ben?
All right, let's start with the New York Times again, shall we?
Do women, I'm just curious, at your place, do women get paid more than those employees that they supervise? Or do you have the New York Times model where actually the supervisor gets paid less than the person that works for the supervisor?
This feels like a trick question.
No, it's just pretty straightforward.
Joe's trying to ask is like whether the janitor, because he's male, gets paid more than the editor-in-chief because she's female.
Because at the New York Times...
No, and that does seem like a bad idea.
Yeah,
to
New York
do
Times,
things that way.
Jill Abramson got paid less than the person that worked under her.
Yes, I wouldn't want to compare that guy to a janitor.
Is that definitely true?
Well, Canaletta is reporting.
And they gave some pretty coded... They gave a very sort of mealy-mouthed comment on it, that their salaries were comparable.
You're talking about the New York Times response to Canaletta's article, which suggests that they weren't comparable. And if any politician gave this sort of response that the New York Times gave, what would have happened to that politician?
I mean, I suspect the Times would have asked for a bit more detail.
I have a little bit of insight into the numbers, and I don't think they're comparable. Well, it kind of depends on what you think is comparable.
They're not comparable.
They are not comparable.
Would you like to give some details?
We're not going to give details, but they are not close to being comparable, especially if you look at the pay scale of the New York Times.
I believe Ken is going to have some more details on this later today.
I think he will. All right, so let's go ahead and go through this story, guys, from the top.
All right.
And let's talk about...
okay, and then I'm going to... Actually, a New York Times reporter, I have tons of different contacts there, did send me something for balance he wanted me to point out. Major shakeup at the New York Times, as we've been talking about. Executive editor Jill Abramson has been dismissed from her responsibilities at the paper, or at least... that's the way the New York Times puts it on today's front page. It's interesting. It's in the Washington Post style section, by the way. Publisher Arthur Sulzberger told the shocked staffers the decision was made because there was, quote, an issue with management in the newsroom. However, there appears to be another issue at play, equal pay. Canaletta of The New Yorker breaks down a different side of the story. He writes, quote, several weeks ago, I'm told, Abramson discovered that her pay and her pension benefits as both executive editor and before that as managing editor were considerably less than the pay and pension benefits of Bill Keller, the male editor whom she replaced in both jobs. She confronted the top brass, one close associate said, and this may have fed into the management's narrative that she was pushy, a characterization that for many has an inescapably gendered aspect. A spokesperson for the Time refutes those claims, saying in part Jill's total compensation as executive editor was directly comparable to Bill Keller's during his time as executive editor. Her pension benefit, like all Times employees, is based on her years of service and compensation. The pension benefit was frozen in 2009, so yes, there would be a difference in pension benefit. Bill was a 30-year employee, most of that time spent prior to 2009. Aletta notes that according to his sources, the pay gap was closed only after Abramson raised concerns about it. He also reports Jill Abramson clashed with the company's CEO over a, quote, intrusion of the business side into the newsroom, as well as the hiring of a new managing editor for the paper's website. Abramson was the Times' first female executive editor, having assumed that role in September of 2011. She will be replaced by Dean Baquet, who becomes the first African-American to run the paper.
And Willie, again, Canaletta reporting, not only was there a difference, his sources and certainly our sources say there was a substantial difference between her pay and Bill Keller's pay in the same position until she can, but also at a previous job she had,
what I'm more interested
her assistant got paid more than she did. When the same thing happened at Time magazine until they got a female editor that opened up the books and said this
doesn't work.
Canaletta's reporting reveals something terrible if you believe all the reporting. And I think the New York Times is going to have to come out and explain in some more detail today. That statement's not going to satisfy a lot of people, and I think its own newspaper will be digging and probably is digging at this very moment. But, you know, we talked about this in a couple of hours ago, which is the tone and the tenor of Jill Abramson being abrasive and pushy and aggressive, and a lot of the things you do see in male bosses, and you see them in newsrooms, and you see them in our newsroom.
At this table.
At this table, at this table, as a matter of fact.
I don't want to talk about my behavior at this table.
No, not your behavior. But
well, actually,
but that's those are usually positive descriptions when you talk about a man, somebody who's not afraid to ruffle feathers and get in there and get their hands dirty. Now, there's a larger picture here. It's not just about the salary, and maybe it's not just about the way she got along with people. The New York Times had some reason that they'll have to explain. But you look at these things individually, and they just don't look good for the New York Times.
And I think, it's hard to get inside an organization and understand what's going on, and I think it's easy to jump to conclusions, but it's also pretty clear that it's been a good paper for the last few years. I mean, I don't think anybody's arguing they haven't had a pretty amazing run, that she doesn't have good news judgment, that they weren't. I mean, they kind of. I mean, I think they really cemented their position as clearly the #1 news organization everybody's gunning for, as others kind of fell away. And, I mean, that's kind of a hard thing to argue with.
Yeah, no doubt about it. John Hyland?
Well, look, Jill Abramson's an awesome journalist, and has a history of having been a great journalist. She was a great reporter when she was at the Wall Street Journal. There's much to be said for her. It's also the case that simultaneously with what you just said, Ben, which is that the paper's had a good run under her journalistically, there has been, as has been reported in many outlets, there's been a fair amount of internal turmoil. That all at her feet. As you said, it's hard to penetrate.
But there's been turmoil at the Times for the past 15 years.
Correct. Yeah, I totally agree. All I'm saying is the story came out of nowhere in the sense that no one expected this to happen yesterday. But if you look at the cumulative reporting about the Times culture over the last 3 years, it's not a total surprise in the sense that it did not seem like it at this moment is the happiest place in the world.
And that's a place where the newsroom has had a lot of power. The newsroom basically fired Howell Raines. Yeah. And I mean, it's a complicated
place. Newsrooms are tough in general because of the nature of what they do. Just for balance, I'd like to just point out the New York Times also said in a message that went out to the staff, we owe Jill an enormous debt of gratitude for positioning the newsroom to succeed on both of these critical counts and, of course, for preserving and extending the level of our journalistic excellence and innovation. She laid a great foundation on which I fully expect Dean and his colleagues will build.
Unfortunately, we'll have to pay him more. All right, so let's move on to another big story on Capitol Hill right now.
In 2 hours, VA Secretary Eric Shinseki